It is important to open all discussion about trauma with the fundamental truth that emotions are the bridge that unite physiology and psychology. Now, on to shame. Shame is a psychological function to ensure innocence and modesty. In this regard, we refer to shame as healthy shame. Healthy shame protects biological functions and spiritual or religious privacy. Privacy is an essential need for the human psyche, just as much as proper bonding is. The aspects of biological healthy shame include privacy with elimination and nudity, and all manner of sexuality. If these are violated in any way, an unnatural shame occurs, we call humiliation. This is unhealthy or toxic shame. Deep-seated humiliation results in trauma and dissociative patterning of the psyche, because what has been shattered is the essential biology and spirit, the two aspects of all life in the physical world. Innocence is a fundamental necessity to normal and healthy growth in life. Violated innocence results in repressed trauma response and fragmentation. The first and foremost experience of violated shame occurs when the infant or small child experiences the existential threat of abandonment, whether physical, emotional, or both. This is akin to the mirror being shattered and the singing voice of life gone silent. Of course, the experiencing of abandonment stems from unavailable mirroring and echoing, or improper and interrupted mirroring and echoing, that which is not authentic safety and nurturing messages from the parent or environment. If the adult child becomes a parent and suffers in adulthood from dependency disorder, it cannot meet the dependency needs of its offspring. Codependency is one word for the psychophysiological response mechanism of trauma that the child is left in. Another word to describe this intricate but fundamental wounding is narcissism. Narcissism is born out of primal needs being unmet and primal bonding not occurring, and behaviors develop unconsciously and in the parasympathetic nervous system to compensate for the threat experienced by the child. It becomes like a desert that can never get enough water. Always dry, always thirsty, always hungered. Wherever this person goes and interacts with others, a demand then is placed on the external others and the environment to meet the insatiable need for life-sustaining waters, or metaphoric blood. This is known as narcissistic supply. The dependency disordered person is in a state of taking constantly and fundamentally unable to give and nurture itself or others. The shame from abandonment, primal abandonment, is at the heart of this phenomenon. Toxic shame creates the need for chronic, external, deformed attention from others. This phenomenon is also known as the shame bind, because the self is now bound in neediness that can never be met. The shame bind is both physiological and psychological. Both are a form of imprisonment within the self. The self will never feel safe, secure with itself or with the world, and will be left unable to trust. This primal rejection and abandonment is experienced as loss of self or death of self, for the self of the infant child internalizes the inadequacy. Psychologically, the infant child is dependent for its survival on its caretakers or parents, so it becomes impossible to perceive them as faulty. If it were possible to perceive the parents as faulty, the threat of death would overwhelm the infant child, especially physiologically. The physiology of mammals is therefore designed with protective measures, which are then triggered to ensure survival. This is the origin of the fight or flight and immobility response, which assures emotional numbing through chemicals and hormones secreted by the nervous system, but simultaneously forces the infant child to experience an unnatural guilt, rather than experience the environment as unprepared to support its life. Toxic emotions are now bound with physiological response to trauma. When guilt is physiologically bound to the self in this way, this is also known as the shame bind. Another way to see this is if the young has been left to fend for itself. The fending becomes defensive to cope with the now threatening environment. As with shame, healthy guilt is a necessary social barometer. Toxic shame produces humiliation, while toxic guilt produces remorse. Repressed, they become fused with the core identity of the self, which then renders it incapable of experiencing empathy toward itself as long as it stays inhabited by its own shame and guilt. As long as empathy is incapacitated, innocence can never be known. One cannot be innocent and guilty at the same time. Abnormal and unbalanced behaviors develop out of this experience. This individual, over time and from childhood, begins to learn that harming others through conflict and its defensive posturing satisfies the inner agonizing predicament. Conflict with the external environment becomes the only option. Why? Harming others produces a great amount of emotional binding to the dependency disordered individual whose original bonding needs went unmet. This feels like the resolution to the abandonment crisis. The inner terror is quieted if the other being harmed stays in interaction, though now stuck in negative response feedback loops, for at least the other stays to argue and fight. As well, a deep-seated anger and fury fused with defensiveness, even in early childhood, is now bound up with the identity of the self and cannot help but to express itself as such, for the negative responses it ensures are satisfying the earlier despair experienced. But this satisfaction is always temporary. Real resolution of terror and rage has not occurred, and so the compulsive need to continue to persevere in negative behaviors, forever seeking relief and resolution. But that only ensures that skewed attention and skewed mirroring will continue in a permanent way. Mirroring and echoing are now forced from the environment, though deformed and in perversion. The shame bind saves the self from facing the existential crisis of primal abandonment, while at the same time the self becomes dangerous to itself, for it is now poisoned with guilt for its own existence. The shame-guilt bind is a paradox of survival, for the bind is the result of the unmet bond. The bind is now at the heart of the hard drive. All programming coming from the hard drive has been encoded with the shame-guilt-bind wound, the now primal binary code. Every program has developed a virus. The virus is sent through all parts of the computer or individual. It enters the neurological messaging system from the brain, messages through the biological realm, and as it is metabolizing from the parasympathetic fight-or-flight system, it bypasses the cognitive mind and is stored in mostly unconscious parasympathetic arena to protect the individual from the threat experienced. Therefore, the psychological, mental, intellectual, emotional, and the spiritual landscape and realm of the individual is infected with the virus and defective coding. although that which once ensured life physically now ensures the deprivation of it on the non-physical levels. Repression of creative impulse now continually streams through the experience around the clock and through the years and lifetime. Therapy and trauma unit may arrive or be sought out, in which case, as with IT specialists, the virus can be located and brought out of the complex systems of the computer or the individual, but it can be a lengthy and timely process, working toward traumatic resolution of the primal shame bond, just as removing the virus from the software frees up the programs for creativity and healthy expression, and life returns to the system. It is recommended, for this is one of the core of all psychological and emotional imbalances. It is such a central human truth that religion refers to the healing of it as the return to grace. What role religion plays in ensuring the shame bind is due for further discussion, which in itself is an irony. Suffice to say that healing from shame is so fundamental to the healing of man that it is part of our metaphysical reality, where the psychological wound is freed from the physiological bind. Healing from primary embedded shame and guilt happens at the heart of our spiritual world, which leads to experience beyond the physical and the mundane. It restores the soul to the self, and there are no words to describe finding that which was believed to be impossible to find. This is healing of the shame bind wound.